Gareth Lim from Singapore, and Mahin De Silva from Sri Lanka. So thank you very much to all the international adjudicators in particular, as well as Mahin, for volunteering and giving up your time to judge this debate. Without a kind reminder to all the observers in the Zoom call here today that you are not expected, no, you're not allowed to interrupt the debate at any point in time or communicate with any of the debaters while they speak. The rules of the debate are, I'm sure everyone is aware, 8-minute substantive speeches, 4-minute reply speeches. You can offer POIs between the 1st and the 7th minute. We will have a timer. Put the timings in the chat so that everyone is aware, and please keep to time. Having said that, without further ado, I kindly request Claire to take on proceedings and proceed with the debate. Good luck to both teams.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this grand final between Ladies College and Royal College. The resolution is that this House regrets the decision by Facebook and other social media platforms, including Twitter and Instagram, to ban Donald Trump. I'd like to welcome the team from Ladies College, Tirati, Daphne and Neha, and from Royal College, Sukit, Janul and Michael. And I'd like to call upon the first speaker of Ladies College to open the debate. Thank you very much.
Can I be heard by everyone? Your Honor, just a few days ago, we saw one of the most violent uprisings within the capital city in America, right? We saw this storming on the Capitol building. There are people who for the longest time have been fed the rhetoric that they are the ones who are silenced, they are the ones who are victims in this situation, reached a boiling point where they felt the need to make themselves heard. Understand that the social media platforms that are instrumental in informing people at these times then made the decision to not just silence the only person who has influence to stop this violence, but actively ban them from engaging on this platform. And we see that as a problem on our side of the house. The loss of connection with Donald Trump and his voter base and the possibility to dissipate the violence has harmed not just people within that specific context, but it also has implications on how it's going to harm discourse when it's most needed in emergency situations. And that is why we find this regrettable. Our burden to prove in the House today is that firstly banning Donald Trump from Twitter and all of the social media has created disproportionate harm in the House. Before I move on into our arguments, a few points of context. Understand that all social media platforms already have check and balance mechanisms to fact check and regulate people on those platforms. You have fact checking mechanisms and even the reporting mechanisms that exist within social media to keep people in check and make sure that they aren't actively inciting violence, right? We believe those measures are enough. And that is the alternative that we support on our side of the House. If Donald Trump were to go and spew misinformation, we would simply have the routine thing that we usually do where we fact check it and label it as misinformation. It's a suspension of him and the banning of him from access to social media and access to engaging with his voter base that we see as a problem. Having said that, I'll move on into our first argument for the House today on the right to access to expression and information. On a first level, understand that social media platforms exist to let people express themselves uniquely, right? This also exists within the dynamic where you conversely exist to let people agree to oppose the views that are being presented. And that is simply the dynamic that you see on social media, right? Someone can tweet whatever they want, and you will have either an outpouring of support or an outpouring of dissent towards those specific sentiments, right? And we see no issue with that. That is the only way that public discourse on social media moves forward. At the point at which you stop someone from engaging or even having access to that kind of engagement, we see a problem where you you as a social media platform are completely removing the right that one person has to that access and to that involvement. Understand that this is completely unjustified because you as a third party simply have no right to be preemptively taking away the rights of certain people before they are even exercised. On a second level, understand that through this decision, you have imposed draconian limitations on preemptive grounds, right? Social media simply cannot make value judgments
Yeah,
of what is and isn't inflammatory and then preemptively block people and stop people from accessing social media, right? Understand that as soon as Donald Trump gained access to social media again, the first thing his followers was to leave Washington, right? Was to declutter capital city and leave. And understand that the only way that sort of engagement is possible is when you allow room for that engagement to exist on outside the house, right? Understand that it's not within the rights of social media companies to simply infringe on another person's access to engagement simply because they think the social platforms political stances, right? It's all too over expressed in the media. Over time, platforms can simply decide when who not their own value. We see as a problem because it's against any political party.
actively cause violence against certain groups.
So we don't think by his followers, right? And the only reason, the thing that Donald Trump said he got onto social media in the first place was to try and dissipate that violence. We don't think that it's speech in order and things and things we move my segment harms. On a first
Yeah,
level, understand that there's unique rhetoric and unique power that Donald Trump himself has over his followers. From the very beginning of his political career, he has built a career and a reputation of building up this sentiment as a whole to be the, and this increased antagonism is the reason why people feel the need to lash out as harshly as understand that by taking this decision, social media platforms have directly played into the hands of that rhetoric, right? Because now Trump supporters have a reason to further victimize themselves. And instead of that existing simply as rhetoric, they now have reasons to believe that because social media platforms have actually taken that decision against them. And when it comes to unique power that Trump has over his followers, I already told you why he's the only person in this specific instant who had the power to stop them and de-escalate the violence, right? Understand that even that possibility of any sort of good and benefit coming out of him having access to social media was effectively removed from the equation as soon as social media companies took this stance. On a second level, understand how this exacerbates existing violence. As soon as a group of people who think they've been silenced to the point where they feel the need to storm the Capitol suddenly get the notification and the news realizing that their leader has been silenced, has been banned from social media, that is further fuel to these people, right? And the people on the ground are the ones who suffer as a result. This not just harms exacerbates existing violence, it's also perceived as the doing of the left, right? And this immediately cuts off any discourse in terms of the credibility that the left has on these social media platforms. Because immediately this disruption of expression and social media presence is seen as something that is left-wing coded. And social media platforms are seen as aiding the democratic establishment as a whole. That as a whole, on a third level, creates a problem where you have no engagement and no discourse occurring as a whole, because you further exacerbate the already existing problem of polarization. What does the alternative look like when you ban Donald Trump from social media? Only his rallies, his speeches, and his direct influence over people exist. Understand how those things and those things that he directly has in relation to his people cannot be fact checked, right? No one's going into a Trump rally and fact checking him. No one is going to provide opposition at a Trump rally. you create echo chambers and perfect places for these people to get further radicalized and get further annulled into his ideas, where there is no discourse occurring within those spaces. And those are the only spaces that you leave available in current status quo when you ban him. For all of these reasons, because we have proved our burden on us at the House, we strongly urge you to side with side proposition.
Am I audible?
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call upon the first speaker of the opposition. Let's welcome Sukit.
The rally in Washington was condoned by Donald Trump. And the reason as to why this situation has become such a major issue is because of the actions taken by Donald Trump by condoning such actions. Don't let our proposition muddy these waters by saying, look, this is a debate on the preemptive debate. The fact of the matter is this debate is made mainly retrospective because of the fact a large deal of harm has already been done in status quo, and the fact of the matter is large amounts of harm has been condoned by Donald Trump. Before moving on to my responses, two things in my framing by which I set up our counter-narrative. First is to understand that we support the decision of banning Donald Trump from social media, but we believe that these actions should have been taken earlier. That is to they needed to have been taken preemptively, but we believe it's the right decision and it's the right step forward in the long run. And secondly, understand that this is the first step in minimizing the influence of these individuals because of the fact that these kind of individuals are harmful in society. Understand, due to this first step, it's going to trickle down to things like support in reduction in airtime for these radical individuals and Trump as a whole. And it's going to be harder for people who are supporting Trump to rally up because of the necessary action being taken. Before moving on to two arguments for the House, firstly as to why why there has to be an imperative to social media as imperative to ban Donald Trump, and secondly as to why we minimize the harms on the ground. A few responses. Firstly, on this idea of Trump actually condoned what was happening in Washington, but the fact, and we believe this is true because of the fact that the only reason Trump condemned this action was after all these problems were occurring. The fact of the matter is, when all of these problems were occurring, the fact is he was condoning these actions, and it was him who riled up these individuals to take this kind of action, and we believe that is harmful. And the only reason Trump actually condemned this action is he knew that it might be harmful for him in the long term, and that is why he did it out of his own self-interest. Moving on to my argumentation, firstly as to why social media has an imperative to ban Donald Trump. Understand the framing of this argument is note that social media is a space that exists so to help and create dialogue and ideas. It is recognized as a space that can have different political opinions. In that instance, it's crucial for the system to function because you have individuals with different voices coming in, and social media is this kind of free space that has this. Understand the premise of this argument is due to Donald Trump's populist ideology, it was forcing individuals into silence. It was harming the main reason of why social media exists, which is to have discourse. Understanding that three things in my first argument. Firstly, understand that Trump inherently advocates hate speech because we don't believe inherently that this is just misinformation. I'll talk to you about misinformation later on, but he also advocates for things like hate speech, and we believe that hate speech is inherently harmful because it causes violence and the expressive function of hate speech is minimal. We see the examples of this is condoning individuals who are going to rally in the capital, but also it extends to these retrospective things that happened in the past. For example, in instances, he advocated for violence in peaceful protests in the BLM. We see in these instances again, we see Trump actually advocating for violence and riling up individuals. Therefore, what we believe is now, because of these reasons, is going to create a direct harm to these individuals. Because of the fact now they're going to feel unsafe. The people who do not support Trump are going to feel unsafe because it's going to harm their dignity. It's going to harm their expression, and finally, it's going to harm their movement. But the extension, and this is very important, the individuals we are talking about are going to be harmed due to these populist ideologies are people who are already vulnerable. They are like the African American community who are already vulnerable in status quo. Moving on to my second idea on misinformation. The fact of the matter is, right now there's a large deal of misinformation coming in status quo. The fact is, what happens when there's misinformation within status quo is because the fact that the side proposition themselves agree, because Trump is so influential, they're going to use that to their advantage and show, look, the Twitter and whatever restricting me. We believe it's far better to restrict and ban them altogether because it reduces any problems that can happen. But fundamentally, what happens due to misinformation is now people who are now going to be nomad are going to be forced to make decisions that they're not going to make otherwise. That is to say, because of the clout that Donald Trump has in the political system, individuals who support Donald Trump are now going to make actions and going to rile up and cause violence, and it's going to be harmful and going to be felt by the people who are vulnerable. Third and final idea is to understand that all these harms took place in social media, and social media was utilized as a platform that used to rile up individuals. The implication of this is, first, it broke the code of conduct of social media, which is something that should not have been done. And secondly, understand that all the violence caused on the ground is linked to social media, and that's a harmful implication. So principle is saying the fact of the matter is, because of all the harms being caused due to social media, the moral imperative of social media institutes is to take the necessary action and banning Trump because of this reason. Understand that not doing so implicitly says that these institutions support these kind of action, and that's harmful. The tie-up to this argument is to understand that this argument exists no matter the implications of doing so, because of the harm being so great before this happening. Second argument then as to why we minimize the harms on the ground. Two things. First, understand we eliminate the ability for Donald Trump to spread more hate. The fact of the matter is, right now in status quo, the amount of hate being spread is in massive scale, because if you take Twitter, he has one of the biggest Twitter followings in Twitter as a whole. In that instance, the ability for him to fuel hate is so great. What does this look like? It looks like Donald Trump riling up individuals to lash out against people like African Americans, immigrants, and against to contest the vote, for example. That's what inherently it looks like. And to some degree now, what's going to happen is going to restrict the amount of reach for these followers to a great deal. And we believe even if the niche group is going to exist, it's going to be far better on our side, because it's going to restrict the amount of people he's going to reach. Why do we believe this is two things? Firstly, as to why it's going to lower the ability for these individuals to rally against this, because they can't really rally as a singular entity, because the face of this entity is going to be hard out of order, ma'am. The fact of the matter is, now people are not going to have to gain necessary access to Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is going to be hard for Donald Trump to give the orders now because of the restriction. But second, it's going to lower the mentality of supporters to actually go out and take necessary action against this. Why? Because the supporters who are not as indoctrinated are less secure, because they know necessary action are taken against individuals who are going against the Trump, and this gang mentality isn't going to exist in our paradigm because they're going to be scared, because they can't really rally as a singular unit. Fundamentally, because of the fact that oppression, because of the fact that hate speech creates oppression, please side with opposition.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call on the second speaker of the proposition. Let's welcome Daphne.
Am I audible? For side opposition to win this debate, they need to tell us why existing mechanisms on social media, like reporting tweets, like Twitter themselves fact-checking tweets or taking down tweets that have hate speech in them, weren't enough, and why this banning itself was necessary on their side of the house and therefore not regrettable. The fact that they failed to do this in their first constructive speech already lost them this debate. 3 points of responses that I'll deal with before my argument on how it's counterintuitive to social media companies themselves. But before that, I'd like to point out that there was no response whatsoever from their side to my first speaker's entire argument on how it harms discourse and the unique impact Trump has on his supporters, and the 2 principles on the precedent it sets in social media as taking political stance, and about how it sets preemptive limit, about how this is form of preemptive, it's a preemptive mechanism. 3 points of responses first. Firstly, on the entire argumentation that the storming of Capitol was in fact condoned by Trump. Because firstly, that was not the case. Because a majority of the extreme right was anyway planning on retaliating against the Biden government after the loss. It was something that anger that already existed and was not a direct facilitation by Donald Trump himself. But in addition to that, it was the people themselves that planned the storming of the Capitol through whatever means they did, not through Trump's Twitter account and whatnot. They need to show us the link between Donald Trump having an active Twitter account and the storming of the Capitol if they want to prove that point. But even if let's take them on their best case and say that Donald Trump did in fact condone all of this, for that to work in this debate, they need to tell us why those existing mechanisms of holding Donald Trump accountable on social media weren't enough to prevent the storming of the Capitol. The point at which they don't do that, we've already proved to you why Donald Trump didn't condone this. But secondly, let's deal with the duty of social media. And that's when they come up and open their argument with the fact that social media is, the purpose of social media is to create discourse of different ideologies. And that is where they lose this debate. Because now you ban a leader who represents a majority of conservatives and extreme right-wing beliefs on the basis of preemptive judgment, on the basis that he was going to say something bad. And that is why they fail to, one, justify why it's principally justified in restricting someone's expression and access to expression on the basis that they were going to do something bad. Ex-convicts are given the right to free movement even though they've created violence in the past, because you understand that now that you hope that the existing deterrent will prevent them from creating further harm. Similarly, just because Donald Trump has said hate speech in the past, that doesn't mean you ban his Twitter account on the basis that he may create some form of harm
he may say something problematic, and they haven't told us why that's not the case. But secondly, we believe that social media themselves are not, when they tell us that Trump's ideas are harmful. Social media companies, profit-motivated companies, have no right and are not justified in placing value judgments on what political ideologies are right and wrong. And that is when, on their side of the house, when you justify this sort of restriction and banning of Trump, which creates this culture of you being able to restrict political opinion when it doesn't seem fit with what the social media company believes in or believes is what should be on that platform and whatnot, and that is extremely problematic. But thirdly, when they talk about the fact that the purpose of a social media is to prevent any form of violence and create a sort of safe platform. Firstly, we understand that if it is within their duty to prevent violence, the existence of Trump on this platform would have prevented it, because we told you that if Trump was given access to his social media account, instead of giving a statement later on saying, telling his supporters to leave the capital, he could have said it on social media itself, prevented a lot more violence from happening. But even if that wasn't the case, at least on our side of the house, what our alternative looks like is the fact that Trump now has access to social media, which means liberals themselves and people who oppose Trump have access to his tweets. There's active discourse that goes on under anything problematic he says. On their comparative, what happens when he doesn't have access to saying these things on social media, he goes to rallies and talks to the very people who go there to get a confirmation bias, the very people who already believe what he's saying. But furthermore, let's look at the group of people who are on the fence. People on the fence who now only have access to what Trump says on the media or at his rallies and campaigns with only his people, that those are the people who will believe what he is saying, because there's no form of opposition or checking mechanism that holds him accountable. This is uniquely beneficial to social media. All of this, which my first speaker brought up, no response whatsoever. But in addition to that, we believe, this was my third point about how this deterrence and it would have prevented their second argument of how on the deterrence. I already dealt with this on my talk, but let's look at the mindset it puts extreme right people in. Why? Because there's already this culture of antagonism towards social media and news outlets. There's already this culture of antagonism towards the left. We understand that now social media themselves are further exacerbating this antagonism, further exacerbating this polarization of these two political ideologies. The moment you remove Donald Trump, who's a key stakeholder in actually bringing the discourse to a middle ground, you remove him from the equation. That is where you can't have these two ideologies to actually have some form of discourse. Because we've already seen some form of antagonism on the part of extreme right in the mass censorship of his tweets and whatnot. There is and will be a long-term retaliation from the extreme right to ban him from Twitter. This moves me on in my argument, but before that, your point, sir.
Ma'am, Biden removing Trump from office arguably had the same permanency and impact and shut out the right-wing populist extremists that you talk about even more. Does that mean you regret that as well?
No, the difference here is that was an electoral system and being voted in. You're talking about social media, a third party removing Trump's access to his right to express his views or right to access his views, which is entirely different. But here's the thing, that is that with that POI, you, sir, concede to the fact that this sort of violence was anyway guaranteed with the loss of the election. It's something that was inevitable and not directly linked to Donald Trump's tweets and that when you fail to make that link, you lose this debate. This moves me on to my argument on how this is counterintuitive to the social media company. First, we understand that we, as a house, as six rational individuals, you understand that this actively disincentivizes right-wing and extreme right-wing users on social media. Why? Because one, they see Trump as this role model. They're extremely loyal to Trump. Any retaliation against Trump is something they're going to retaliate against. Which means one, they move off these social media platforms because Twitter has taken and set the precedent that we don't support Trump on our platforms. Or you have another reason that they're more likely to move off these platforms is the fact that these companies themselves have set the precedent that they oppose Trump's ideologies, even if it's based on preemptive presumptions and whatnot. Why is this harmful? They're moving off these platforms. One, because these social media companies themselves gain profits off of the existence of Republicans and just users on their platforms themselves. But they also gain profits off of Trump's like they gain profits off of Trump's ad campaigns during his first election. They gain for gain profits off of the Republicans on these social media accounts. And therefore, it's counterintuitive to the social media company themselves to impose a ban on Trump. But on our side of the house, one, we believe that it's principally unjustified to ban Donald Trump off Twitter. But in addition to that, you worsen the mindset of these extreme right conservatives, and you worsen the sort of violence that existed in the Capitol in the past 2 days. I've never been prouder to propose.
Thank you very much, Divya. And now I'd like to call upon the second speaker of the opposition, Janul.
Can I be heard? Can I be heard? Sorry. Thank you. Panel, even as someone who enjoys like strange arguments and leaps of logic, I find it hard to believe that expressions like stop the count, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and actively condoning the violence have any expressive function of value in this debate. Rather, the sucking of the populists of any discourse into the populist gutter, where everything gets crowded out by the white noise that populism inherently brings, where you drown out people by making them fearful, by making them feel like they do not belong, is not a valid contribution to discourse, and therefore they don't get to stand on this fancy like freedom of speech argument that they try to do so. Before I move into my two levels of response, I'm just going to clarify two things. One, in their world, and this is the framing that affects their entire case, they're reliant on those like Trump, and they're reliant on that goodwill. They rely on the goodwill of individuals with mass followings that have stepped out of line, that continue to step out of line, and will probably continue to do so opportunistically when they see fit, when they see a possibility of managing to retain power by inciting violence and harming groups of individuals. They rely on these individuals to stand in line when they have failed to do so for far too long. What we have to hear, and what we have not heard across two speeches, is any kind of incentive other than purely political incentives for Trump to stay in line. If we prove that in even a certain instance where he sees some kind of political gain by inciting violence and by bringing his rabble outside the gates of the Capitol again, he will continue to do so. That framing panel loses them this debate. The second point I want to clarify before anything else is just the disingenuous characterization of Trump tweets. They've been using the word preemptive so many times, does not take away from the fact that hate speech has happened, continues to happen, and did happen Trump knowingly. Things like when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and actively telling people to come to the Capitol that like this vote is being counted and that we're putting Biden out of power, are violence being directed against certain parts of society. You cannot sugarcoat that in it. But also, I just want you to know that if the average person like puts like 2 instances of like hate speech on social media, their account is probably going to be banned, if not forever, for at least a significantly long period of time. So their characterization that the only method of response is like reporting it is harmful. 2 reasons why. One, there's a period of time between reporting a post and its removal. And that's why, for instance, in the case of like the Rohingya crisis, some posts were so incredibly problematic because the violence that spilled over between the post being deleted and the post being posted, it was exponentially high. Again, they need to internalize all these impacts. If even in one instance out of like 100, Trump chooses to tweet something that incites violence. But second, just a constant breaking of the code of conduct of social media. So we think that there is a justification. But thirdly, ignore the conflation panel of
hate speech and misinformation with political opinion. This debate is not about political opinion. I think courts and individuals are in the vast majority of instances able to differentiate when something is hate speech and a matter of political opinion. Saying that I support immigrants being put out of the country is vastly different from saying that I think that all immigrants are murderers and rapists and should be shot. That distinction is something that they choose to just be incredibly disingenuous about. I just don't think that's good strategy. First question then as to why social media is imperative to ban like the Trump majority, why there is an imperative. Notice that the vast majority of the argumentation bases itself on this idea of freedom of expression. Note that in the vast majority of instances, freedom of expression can be curtailed in the instance of things like hate speech and hegemonic speech for the very same reasons they claim. Because the premise of their argument, which they consider like a concession, works against them. Because freedom of speech and discourse only work if individuals are able to speak their mind without the fear of being shut down. Notice again, they make a massive conflation. Trump is not the entire right-wing party. So when they say that we leave all these people without a voice, that is simply not true. There are other right-wing candidates that can stand for the same kind of issues, that can voice the same concerns. It just doesn't have to be Trump. Sure, even if there are some individuals that like stand for his own populism, we know that there can be other populist leaders, but if they resort to things like hate speech as well, we'd ban them too. We don't think the right-wing party in and of itself needs hate speech as the sole mechanism for getting their content across. They need to prove that in the next speech. What then do we hear in their work? This idea that their political stance is somehow linked to hate speech, I already dealt with it, but two, that this information is somehow important to discourse. I think that Trump's speech that calls for violence against certain parties doesn't want a response. You just want people to go out and lash out and be violent. In certain instances where you call for like violence against the Black Lives Matter protests, and you see like people in Minnesota like taking AK-47s and going and shooting at these protesters, often there is direct violence that you cause through your actions. But again, then they want us to prove that Trump had a direct impact on like the Capitol, like people going to the Capitol. No, we don't need to do that. If you prove that to at least some degree he made it worse and made at least one more supporter go there, he actively contributed to making the lives lost on the ground or the harm that happened on the ground exponentially worse. So the point is, we don't need to prove like a direct link that he incited the protest in and of himself, but rather that he had some degree of control. Even then, the fact that he didn't stop it at the very moment that he could makes him culpable, because we think that negligence is a justified principle. If you could have stopped it, we think he should have. The fact that he didn't means that there needs to be some kind of penalty. But ultimately, again, the tie-up then to this argument is they rely on him never stepping out of line in the future for this argument to fly, when the amount of misinformation, the amount of hate speech he has put out just simply don't make that true. Ultimately, then the argument about social media making profits just simply doesn't fly, because it doesn't make sense in the context that social media is actively facilitating the harms of the Trump regime being in power. We think that the social cost that has is something that means we like support the decision, even if they lose out on profit, that simply weighs out at the end of the debate. Second question then as to who minimizes harms on the ground. The extent of argumentation we hear is strange, because the extent of argumentation is the left feels shut out. You make them feel more shut out when Trump is out of power. One, we don't put the entire right wing out of power. They still have like countless other MPs that aren't flaming bigots who like spew like racist vitriol. They can probably cater to their interests, and these are individuals that get blocked out because of Trump. But crucially, note that that same argumentation can be used for literally anything the left does. The left bringing Biden into power and like voting out Trump is something that is like along the same lines and shuts out the voice of the like right-wing hardliners that they talk about. Again, that then concedes that the misinformation that Trump feeds them, that the vote was a lie and that Biden got into power through unscrupulous means that you're likely to have some individuals that would still rally for Trump if Trump ever saw the perfect opportunity with which to ride back into power using like his populist agenda and bringing like his racist following. Crucially then, the extent of response we hear is that there are like Trump rallies that you do not control what goes on. That neglects Suchit's framing that first, these rallies are likely to become much harder to organize, because we think that there is a gradual process of eliminating Trump's presence in like the digital and like field of like media in general. But crucially, we think that the worst individuals that are likely to go into underground like niche QAnon sites and like underground Facebook groups aren't necessarily the majority burden list, because those individuals are likely to be radical in both worlds, are still likely to be violent in both worlds, are still likely to always believe that Trump is right, that Trump is the messiah of like whatever radical evangelical movement they have. These individuals are not the majority burden list. The majority burden in this debate are the individuals that are harmed when you take away their ability to rally. When you shut out their figureheads from being able to support these campaigns on a vast scale, where you lower their gang mentality because they see their leader being taken down and they lose out on that feeling of constantly having like everyone else looking the other way because they don't see it as being important. You empower the victims of this cause to rise up against Trump and his cronies because you see them as being able to pass realistic change. Extensions to this are, one, you now say that corporations aren't going to turn a blind eye when hate speech happens just because individuals are powerful. So you get monitoring on hate speech on a large scale. No, this is not political opinion. These groups cannot choose like what content to take away. What Trump says is hate speech. You cannot take away from it. At first, it's hegemonic speech that makes these people afraid to move out, that makes these people afraid to express their opinions. That is just as culpable. Panel, misinformation is violence. That silence that those Trump supporters force these people into is oppression. For those reasons, panel, we urge you to side with opposition.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call on the third speaker of the proposition. Let's welcome Reha.
Hi, can I be seen and heard? Hannah, side opposition just can't win this debate by making it about hate speech in a broader context. We are talking about a very specific situation in this debate. It is about whether or not we regret Facebook, Twitter, and all these social media platforms shutting Donald Trump out at the point at which people were invading the Capitol. Note that he is the person that all of these individuals directly respond to. At the point at which he says to stop doing what they are doing and that he doesn't support all of the actions that they are committing, they would end up stopping, they would end up going home. In the counter narrative, we tell you that at the point at which they were Donald Trump was taken away the ability to communicate with his audience, that is when the increase of this violence existed. That is when you weren't able to nip it in the bud as fast as possible. We're so proud to propose. I have two main clashes in this debate. First, on if it is just to ban Donald Trump from Twitter altogether. And secondly, on if Donald Trump incited violence altogether and how it affects individuals on the ground. First, let's deal with if it is just to ban Donald Trump from Twitter altogether. I want you to note that the grounds on which Donald Trump was banned was not because of the fact that he said anything problematic on social media with regards to the Capitol in itself. He never told people to storm the Capitol. He never told people to do that. That means that then it is unjust to take any of his tweets or rather to ban him altogether from social media. Why this is problematic is because you're preempting the fact that just because he said something at a rally, he's going to say it on social media as well. That preemptive justification is simply not enough at the point at which you need to express something in order for people to decide if your expression was legitimate or not. They can't say that right to expression can be curbed in certain instances at the point at which the expression was never made in the first place. They simply cannot win that ground. But second, when he simply riled people up, we think that that's not necessarily true in the context of the Capitol altogether, because of the fact that even if social media is important for, like they concede that social media is important for discourse, and the fact that Trump was polarizing people, we simply don't think that that is their decision to make. At the point at which right-wing populism is a legitimate form of political expression, whether they were doing things like hate speech or not, that existed far later. The point at which Twitter or any other social media platform banned Donald Trump was on the basis that he was saying something related to the riots at the Capitol. He simply did not do that. This is not a good enough justification. If they would have answered any of the POIs that we had asked them, given from their first speech, we would ask them if they would ban Donald Trump from Twitter altogether, because they seem to have problems with his rhetoric altogether. We think that if you were to do that, you're creating far more issues on the ground. I will deal with that in my second argument. Third, when they say that they made massive harms on social media and that as a result of the fact that he's taken up, even if people can preemptively understand the fact that Donald Trump is going to do something like this, even if Twitter thinks they're perfectly accurate in understanding that Donald Trump is going to get on that platform and say something problematic, at the point at which he doesn't, they don't get to take that step, they lose this debate. Before I move on to my second clash, I'll take that point.
Ma'am, second speaker explicitly supports deleting Trump's content in the case of hate speech. Doesn't that mean then that Trump's voice that needs to be heard doesn't get heard in your word in certain instances?
So we think that in certain instances of extreme hate speech, we're fine with taking that content down. But in most instances where it's just misinformation, wherein there is voter fraud, but that is not really true, you can flag those things and deal with those issues on the platform itself. We think that that's perfectly fine. In the instance when it's extreme hate speech, we don't think that that content is really going to be beneficial in the climate that we're talking about. Let's deal with the second clash then on if Trump in fact incited violence on social media and how that affects people on a ground level. First, we already told you that there are fact-checking mechanisms that help you to mitigate certain issues that exist with regards to Trump saying things that aren't fully truthful on his social media. They needed to prove to us throughout this entire debate why that is simply not enough. It is not enough for Donald to come up here with his rhetorical flourish and say that there is increased amount of hate speech, that there's a huge amount of problems for the most vulnerable, at the point at which they don't explain to us why social media platforms using their existing check and balance mechanisms is simply not enough. But second, we told you that it also legitimizes the victimization of Donald Trump at any of his constituents. This was analysis that was just not responded to from their first argument in itself. We told you that when you legitimize victimization, that means that A, it gives them just grounds to act harmfully towards individuals that they feel like are harming them. That is the left, that is vulnerable individuals that we're talking about. So on their side of the house, you're creating grounds for which harms can be created far more, particularly because now it is not just blatant assumptions that they're making, it is actual grounds on which they can make assumptions by saying that we were shut out by politicians. And it is not enough to say that Trump is not the entire party and that there are other individuals who can speak on behalf of them. Because at the point at which Trump is the leader of that party right now, at the point at which Trump is the president, people identify with him far more than they identify with any other individual in that party. He is the person who has the unique ability to string that rhetoric, and we think that as a result of that, he is able to stop it, but also people feel like they have been robbed of their expression and they've been robbed of someone that represents them in itself the moment that they take away Trump from Twitter. Third, when they tell us that there's more problematic hate that exists on this platform, we already told you that this hate is going to get filtered by these platforms. They're extremely directly problematic, which we don't see that Trump actually said anything that was directly problematic related to the Capitol, which is what makes this motion regrettable. But note that even if that was the case, we think that on our side of the house, we create an avenue through which we can express something versus on their side where that hate doesn't go away, it stays and it incubates itself and it creates far more harms to people on the ground. They harm the vulnerable far more. Panel, even on that best case scenario, Donald Trump did in fact do something to incite violence on the Capitol that very day. He is the only person that is able to stop it. It is not enough for social media to clamp down avenues through which hate can exist. They also need to clamp down avenues through which hate and violence can be stopped. And at the point of they don't do that, they fail their mechanism. On their side of the house, they fail to prove to us why this exists. Third, then we talk about social media. We told you that social media platforms themselves lose any sort of constituents that they may have and customers that they may have as a result of the fact that they're shutting people out in a way that we told you is so problematic. We think that makes them as a stakeholder lose out on a whole lot of individuals that could be potential clients to their their platform. We think that this is, we understand like a very minute issue, but we think that but we don't think that the trade-off is necessary at the point at which it doesn't bring any tangible benefits, and they haven't been able to prove that it brings any tangible benefits. If they say that it seems like social media is standing by hate, they're not doing that because they're using the same checking mechanisms that they're using for everyone else. No one's making an exception for Donald Trump. They're doing the same thing that they would do for everyone else. On their side of the house, they have a burden to prove that in the absence of Donald Trump's Twitter being banned, that he would still be able to communicate to those masses and have them calm down the way that he was able to. The only reason that you aren't seeing bloodshed on the streets right now is because he got access to his Twitter again, because he's communicating with these people, because he has that form of interaction. On our side of the house, we're the only individuals who are able to eliminate violence. We're the only individuals who are giving people a safe platform to operate within. Please propose.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to ask the last substantive speaker from the opposition to come forward. Let's welcome Michael.
Can I be heard? Judicatory panel and members of the House. When opposition comes up here and tells us that the only person who can actually go out there and silence this problem is Donald Trump, then they have to come up here and prove to us as why he will go out and actively do it. We tell you that there is more potential for harm because considering the character that Donald Trump is, in the past he has used the same amount of this influence and power he has that he can use to stop this violence, but instead he has opted to create more violence. He has opted to actively go out there and spread more misinformation. And we tell you that if you cannot trust an individual like this to do something to prevent more harm from happening. And we tell you that they have to come up here and prove to us as to why he's the best suited to actually go out there and stop this harm, and why he actively would do it when he's the sort of person who would exploit every opportunity he sees to go out there and gain more power and spread his false populism as well. It's extremely harmful, and that is a risk not worth taking, because we're talking about the amount of lives that are being lost. We're talking about misinformation being spread, no thank you, causing of massive riots, and it's extremely harmful for the stability of the country. We tell you that on that alone, we feel that we win this debate. Now, two main questions that were talked about in this debate. The first one being on the principle and whether it's actually justified for were these social media companies justified in doing so, and the second one on the pragmatics that were supposed to come out of this. Now, firstly, this whole idea of discourse, it's not really discourse when you're talking about Donald Trump, because the fact of the matter is it's not giving a valid political opinion in this case. The fact of the matter is when you have a character continuously sprouting misinformation, he's constantly been doing it ever since the election started, without evidence of there being voter fraud, continuously telling them, actively asking his voters to go to like voting centers and telling them to disrupt activities there, going out there and telling people to stop the count or whatever. These sort of things are not political opinions, but rather things that incite violence, incite hate amongst, and incite just nuisances to society. And the fact of the matter is, it's not only that, it doesn't stop at misinformation when it comes to Donald Trump. We gave you examples as to how he has this tendency to use violent terms, this tendency to actually this tendency to sprout hate speech as well. When you have him coming up and saying, "Oh, when the looting starts, the shooting starts," this sort of thing. The fact of the matter is, because of his influence as well, that side opposition talks about a lot. We tell you that. That because of his influence as well, it's really harmful when he can control such a majority of the population. And we tell you that the only thing we regret is social media not banning him earlier. Now, the fact of the matter is, they try to come up here and tell us that, oh, Trump didn't plan it. He didn't really have, you can't really draw the link to Trump. But the fact of the matter is, why didn't he stop it then? Why didn't he stop it then when he knew that these sort of things are happening? Instead, he chose to stay silent or condone this sort of activity. And we tell you that in itself is enough justification as to how as to why what happened is regrettable. Also, why not regrettable. Also, the fact of the matter is, he has allowed these things in the past as well, whereas he never really condemned the brutal the brutal activities that the police conducted on people like George Floyd or whatever. He never really condemned those sort of things. So how can you trust someone who cannot judge the objectively wrong things within society and condemn them and condone sort of things that cause mass hatred and cause harm in general? We tell you that is extremely problematic. Another thing now, the main premise of the case was that fine, that side opposition does not have any counter, that the existing mechanisms are not enough, the existing mechanisms are enough, and like fact checking or whatever. Okay, we'll give you a few reasons as to why it's not enough. The fact of the matter is, it takes time for these sort of things to be labeled as misinformation as well. So as soon as Trump puts it on his social media, Twitter or whatever, lots of people see it, lots of people take screenshots of it, and lots of people share this, and it gets circulated amongst these people as well. And we tell you that then and there itself, it's really harmful, because that word gets out to a lot of people, and we tell you that's one reason as to why it doesn't work. But secondly, if you buy into their characterization of these people, then Donald Trump can just come up and say, "Oh, these social media companies are against me, or it's not going to be working." So, but we tell you, we gave you examples as to why it's extremely important for why it's the same thing for anything the left does then. Because, for example, Joe Biden getting elected or whatever. So that basically just washes out the whole thing. And either way, it's not really a big issue in this debate. That's why we told you as to why it's important that social media prevents these things from happening further and more. So basically, on the ground that we showed you as to how it's not really discourse, and that there's no expressive value in what he's saying. The fact of the matter is, he's just inciting hate speech. He's inciting problematic things that are extremely harmful, and actively have tangible harm on majority of people living in the US. They actively have this harm on people, on the police or whatever, on the security of the building or whatever. It's really harmful, and we tell you that Donald Trump should have been stopped earlier. Now, moving on into the second idea on moving on into the second idea on the pragmatics that came out of this. This wasn't really engaged much by side proposition. The fact of the matter is, we told you as to how you're eliminating the harms of this of him spreading more hate speech. Now, they cannot, they try to come up here and tell us, "Oh, fine, that it's preemptive and you can't preemptively do this." But we tell you that that it's not preemptive, because he has done so many things in the past that warrant this ban. But even if it was preemptive, it's totally fine, because he has done so many things in the past as well. And we tell you that it's totally fine, and that it minimizes the harms. No, thank you. It minimizes the harms of his ideologies and his extreme ideologies spreading more and more, and it eliminates some harm of him being a part of this as well. Now, moving on in that same thing, they never really engaged with our argumentation as to how even if our side is not really working to the best, there's still some marginal benefit, because of the fact that now the main leader who's actually creating these issues does not have a say anymore. So even these niche groups, or these echo chambers, if you like, that they come up and tell, they exist anyway on both sides of the house. Now what they don't have is a legitimate figure that backs up whatever that they're saying. And we tell you that that it's much better on our side of the house because there's less harm. And also they refuse to rebut any of the points we bring to you when we talk to you about how it empowers the people who have been victims of Trump's horrible campaign, who empowers the people, the minorities who have suffered from police brutality to stand up to such pressing issues. And it's better for the whole social media industry as a whole because you're censoring these things, and it creates a precedent for these companies to actually censor things more, censor hate speech much efficiently. Finally, on this whole issue of the right-wingers, we tell you that Trump is not the only person within the right-wing party, and that and this whole issue on social media companies and profit or whatever simply washes out because the moral imperative outweighs that as a whole. So all in all, we urge you to side with opposition.
Thank you very much. We now come to the summary speeches. And of course, the convention is that we hear first from the opposition and then from the proposition. So I'd like to welcome back Janul to summarise his team's argument.
Can you hear me? Panel, if nothing else, I think the case you heard from proposition is a testament to their faith. The fact that they chose to buttress their entire case on this notion that Trump will somehow act in the goodwill and good faith with the interests of the people. That you rely on the goodwill of an actor that for years has been opportunistic, that for years has been selfish, that for years has done nothing but stoke violence, hatred, and spew racist vitriol. I think that loses them this debate, but I'll clarify more reasons as to why we're doing so. Anyway, before anything else, I just want you to know that if you ignore that initial assertion that Trump is going to act in the best interest of the people, what proposition has to stand on is an incredibly negative case. The vast majority of argumentation you hear is that status quo is bad, that we make it worse, that taking away Trump's speech is harmful, but because that makes status quo worse. That negative argumentation does very little to respond to the positive material you hear all the way from Sujit's speech. I'm going to answer two questions. One, is there a social media imperative to ban Trump? Second, who minimizes harms on the ground? On the first question, as to whether there is a social media imperative, I think they largely relied on this mischaracterization of what Trump actually did. Because this motion isn't preemptive, and it looks at what Trump has done over a sustained period of time. Even if it does not explicitly reference the single instance of the Capitol Hill preaching, there is still a multiplicity of issues that Trump actively aided and abetted violence, called for violence against certain groups, be it immigrants, be it minorities, be it peaceful BLM protesters. And we gave you the idea that it was a justified principle at the point at which that crowded out the other discourse that we think is politically valuable. The fact is, if proposition recognizes the principle that expression is valuable, I think they support our side even more, because the individuals that are truly vulnerable, that can have their voice heard in no other way, are specifically the ones who are most targeted out when Trump chooses to use hate speech. Even in direct instances where it wasn't hate speech, we gave you extensions that was about things like misinformation as well, which is particularly harmful given their own analysis that these people believe what Trump says. So if Trump calls out social media as being against him, as ignorantly labeling his posts fake news, people are likely to lash out against that as well. So you force people into making actions they would not otherwise have made. Ultimately, then the fact that both sides to a very large degree ultimately have to come to the consensus that this speech, if not hate speech, does have significant harms to people on the ground, you recognize our principle. Why then do we think it was so harmful for social media to continue their existence? Because irrespective of this quibble of profit we hear as a third argument from their side, we think that there is still a justified principle in banning him, given that he's continuously revoked this the status or whatever agreement you had. Notice the extent of the response then to this argument was to say, look, we can ban those specific tweets. One, that contradicts their principle, because then you wouldn't have perfect discourse if you're taking out some extent of it. But crucially, if you do take them down, the time taken between the post being put up and being taken down is enough to cause significant harms. You heard that in my speech, again in Micah's, not sure why they didn't respond to that. Second question then as to whether you minimize harms on the ground. Again, all they talk about here is premised on an assertion that Trump will do the right thing. If that is not true, all they have to stand on is that people are likely to be even more antagonist. Why did we say that was not true? Because that holds true for literally any statement about anything the left does. The left voting Biden, the left choosing to like sanitize the speech of people like Alex Jones, all these instances would result in the massive right-wing backlash they talk about. The reason we know that's not true is because the right wing isn't solely represented by Trump. The conflation they made simply doesn't hold true. If that is the case, you are more likely to buy our arguments that one, you lower their ability to rally, but two, that you lower their gang mentality. Crucially, the nuance they don't respond to is we conceded that you would have echo chambers to some extent, but the degree at which they're able to cause harm and the extent of resources you need to like send off those masses is much less when they're smaller and easier to manage. Ultimately, then, we empower victims, we take away from the violence that is misinformation, we bring back the voices that need to be heard and drag it back out of the populist gutter. For these reasons, panel, you already side with opposition.
And to conclude this debate, let's welcome back Kirati.
Can I be heard? Panel, our problem at the very beginning of our case was the fact that a time at which it was most instrumental and necessary, these social media platforms essentially removed the only avenue available for the current phase of the populist movement to engage with its people at the time when it was most needed. We told you as soon as he gained access to his followers again, he actively told them to pack up and leave the capital. Understand that in our alternate paradigm where this ban had never been imposed in the first place, all these harms that side opposition wants to talk to you about people being hurt on the ground wouldn't have existed anyway, because we told you that Donald Trump himself has a unique attachment to his followers, and those followers are only going to listen to him when he tells them to leave. That has happened on our paradigm because we told you that it's something that he was going to do anyway. So it's a matter of time and the comparative of time there. Having said that, even if you want to believe side opposition when they say that Donald Trump won't have de-escalated conflict, our main justification that social media platforms cannot preemptively restrict speech when that expression hasn't even been made in the first place is unjustified. That was our main claim. And at the point at which they haven't disputed that thoroughly, that debate, that entire crash falls onto our side of the house. Notice how they are yet to tell you that existing mechanisms simply aren't enough. Understand the threshold of the harm that they are claiming, which is hate speech, is non-comparative because those things are handled by existing mechanisms. I told you this at the beginning of my speech, and therefore there are two main questions in today's debate. Firstly, was this decision justified? And secondly, does our alternative have significant benefit? When it comes to the first question, side opposition tells you that, see, social media platforms can preemptively stop these people when they have a history of hate speech and therefore they somehow do not need a platform. We told you that those things are handled on a case-by-case basis anyway. Our problem here is that you're completely cutting off access that this individual has to his basic right of expression. After that expression has been made, social media can run its usual check and balance mechanisms and do what is necessary. Our problem here isn't that censorship is harmful. We understand that in some situations it is necessary. But the difference here is that, at least on our side of the house, you do not give significant grounding to the assertion and the claim that the right is being silenced and actively censored. What did we tell you on our side of the house? That you exist as a social media platform to let people express their opinions. Understand that I told you that it exists with the converse right for people to oppose you and engage with you on your grounds. It is not absolute, but the grounds for that regulation cannot be exercised without that expression being made in the first place. Understand that even if everything side opposition said you buy the brunt of the argumentation, even then we told you that it sets a precedent where social media platforms can now make value judgments on what kind of politics aren't and are legitimate. And that on a long run will not just harm the right, in some instances, it can even hurt the left. Understand that social media on our side of the house makes its restrictions based on actions and what's currently happening, not on their judgments of what people's characters are. On the second question, on does our alternative actually have significant benefit? Understand the reason why right-wing populism has risen to the scale that it is now. And I told you it's because of the fact that there's this ongoing rhetoric that they are the stakeholder that's being silenced, and that is what invokes the extremism that we are currently seeing. The only way to mitigate that is if you let them have their figurehead, is if you let them have the discourse that's currently happening on social media. Because as long as that exists, they cannot make legitimate claims that they're being silenced by the left, right? And on our side of the house, we have much better discourse because those people have to engage with liberals on platforms. They have to engage with people who oppose their views. And over time, this deplatforming that's happening on their side of the house will lead to further antagonization until we come to the same situation that played out a few days ago. I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you very much. The educators will now spend some time and type their marks and then email me or message me individually with simply their decision. We will then retire to a break room, which we'll be sent into to discuss and look at giving you a